Okay, welcome back to Apocalypse here. Doing something quite a bit different than we have been for a while. We're going to talk about the Old Testament, specifically the book of Judges, and a book written by an Old Testament scholar on a Christological kind of reading of the book of Judges. So I'm going to walk us through that book. It's an incredibly strange, it's beautiful, and honestly, one of the more I think important kind of companion pieces to the book of Judges from a kind of Christological starting point, and that is Daniel Stulak's book, Gift of the Grotesque, a Christological companion to the book of Judges. Now, Stulak, or Stu, as we called him, was one of my Old Testament instructors and Hebrew instructors at Duke. He's a great guy, great scholar, very hard grader. But this is his book. It's a little book through Cascade / Whipfenstock, I'm quite familiar with, publishing with them Beyond Justification, and also my current book through them. So the book is Gift of the Grotesque. Okay. He's got a couple of other Christological companions on 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel as well, which are more recent than this one, but I just do not have them yet. So Judges is a text that I think many Christians avoid or try to kind of moralize their way through, right? We meet assassins, there's mutilations that happen, collapsing social order, civil war, Samson's bizarre strength, the horror of the Levite concubine, right? It is, in a word, grotesque, this book. But Stulak argues that the grotesque is precisely where we need to look if we want to see the Christological kind of shape of the scripture there. So I'm going to walk through a central argument. What is the grotesque? Why it can be a gift? How he reads Judges as a Christological witness rather than a kind of moral disaster that we can, somehow sanitize. Okay. Stulak, I'm going to call him Stu. Stu begins with the problem. Judges is full of material that shocks, repels, destabilizes. Modern readers often recoil when they read it, and understandably so. But he asks, what if this shock is actually part of the theological meaning? Okay. What if the grotesque is a mode of revelation rather than a kind of obstacle to it? Now, drawing on literary theory, Stu defines the grotesque as the clash of two worlds that don't neatly fit together. Okay. The comic with the tragic, right? The beauty and the monstrous, beautiful and the monstrous, the noble and the ridiculous, those sorts of things. The grotesque distorts, it exaggerates, and kind of unsettles us in order to reveal something true. Okay. So Stu emphasizes the grotesque disrupts our illusions about moral clarity. It exposes the fragility of human attempts at order. And it creates a hunger and desire for deliverance, okay, that can't arise from a kind of sanitized storytelling. So the grotesque is not a kind of aesthetic flourish, but for Stu, it is the very texture of a fallen human life. It's violent, fractured, absurd, and yet still somehow, embodying the possibility of grace. This is precisely the point. The grotesque does not obscure Christ. It prepares us in some sense for him. In retrospect, we can see what was there all along and how it was being prepared. Okay, that's going to be key. So the heart of Stulak's reading is the insight that the Judges, in the book of Judges, it contains long sequences of failed saviors, really, failed deliverers. You got Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson. Each one seems kind of promising in their own way. Each one delivers Israel kind of partly and temporarily and ambiguously sometimes. And each one leaves things worse than before. So Stulak argues that there are not simple kind of ethical characters, but they're actually morally messy characters. They're kind of parodies of deliverance and salvation. They show us how human strength collapses, how zeal becomes violence, how vows become traps, how charisma without character becomes a kind of destruction. In other words, Judges demonstrates the kind of futility of looking for salvation from within the structures of kind of fallen humanity. Okay, this is crucial because the grotesque kind of failures of the Judges generate a theological vacuum and kind of space that we can see kind of Christ filling in the light of his revelation. Okay. We don't kind of, we don't see it in a way that's self-evident, right? We can just pick up the text and kind of see Christ there. It's only in the light of that revelation that we can go back and look and read Judges and kind of see Christ there, as he has been there all along and fulfills that particular text. But it's the retrospective emphasis on perception that's important. Okay. So Judges basically teaches us to stop expecting the world to save itself. Okay. One of the most important aspects of Stu's approach is it refuses kind of simplistic typologies. He's not drawing neat lines from like Samson to Jesus or from Gideon to Jesus or something like that. Instead, he frames Judges as a book with a kind of negative space that we can see anticipating Jesus once Jesus kind of arrives and reveals who he is and who he has been all along. Now, what does this mean? Stu says that the book's horrors, the book of Judges, and absurdities create a kind of Christological hunger within the narrative itself. Okay. It's not saying that people wandering around were like expecting Jesus to show up or something like that, but there is a kind of longing for a deliverer. It's implicit there. A deliverer who's faithful rather than volatile, self-giving rather than self-aggrandizing, healing rather than destructive, gentle instead of violent, steadfast and faithful rather than chaotic, truly free rather than enslaved to kind of impulses. In other words, the grotesque depicts the absence of Jesus. And through that absence, the reader comes to desire the presence of Christ. Okay. Judges is a Christological text, not because its character resembles Jesus, but because they fail to resemble him. Okay. And we can only see that in the light of who Jesus is. Christ is the fulfillment, then, once we see that, of what Judges teaches us to kind of long for. Okay. So Stu devotes substantial attention to a few major figures within the text. So let me highlight 3 of those now. So Gideon, basically from anxiety to idolatry is the move here. Gideon starts humble, but spirals into kind of vindictiveness and idolatry. His story demonstrates how the grotesque kind of operates. The more successful Gideon becomes, the more distorted he actually becomes. So Stu reads Gideon as a narrative of spiritual deformation, a warning about charisma, divorce from obedience. And then Jephthah, the kind of grotesque logic of vows. So Jephthah's tragic vow and sacrifice of his daughter is one of the Bible's most disturbing episodes. Many commentators scramble to justify it or to rationalize it. Stu refuses that move. Jephthah's grotesqueness is meant to repel us. Right? His story exposes the violent logic of transactional kind of religion. And it heightens the contrast with God, who gives life rather than demanding it. Okay. So Christ, in this kind of way of framing things, becomes the one who ends that cycle of vow-bound violence through his own self-offering. Okay? And then Samson, the parody of kind of strength. Right. Samson is an absurd character. He's childish. He's impulsive, witty. He's vengeful, almost cartoonishly strong. I made him jacked in the thumbnail, as you'll see. Stu argues that Samson's grotesque strength functions as a parody of divine strength in the strong right arm of deliverance, right? He's a man with all of the charisma of a superhero and none of the interior kind of coherence of a saint. So where Samson's kind of uses his strength for revenge, Christ uses strength for love. Where Samson destroys the enemy through death, Christ defeats death itself with death. Okay. And of course, the resurrection. The book of Judges ends in utter collapse, moral, political, religious. In those days, right, quote, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, end quote. Most people read this as a kind of political critique. If only Israel had a king, right? But Stu wants to see something deeper here. The ending of the book shows us what life looks like when there is no deliverer. Okay? When there is no one to interrupt the cycles of vengeance, idolatry, tribalism, and fragmentation. The grotesque is not simply a literary device, though. It's a portrait of human life without divine rescue. So the final chapters really don't prepare us for David at all. They prepare us for Christ. Okay. But again, I need to make this point, and Stu does too. The perception is retrospective, but Christ has ontologically, in a certain sense, been there all along. We just haven't been able to see it with clarity yet. Okay. Now, why and how the grotesque can actually be a gift, right? So Stu's conclusion is pretty powerful. It's a gift because it tells us the truth about us, about ourselves, and tells it very clearly. Judges is not a dark corner of the Bible we need to defend or kind of sanitize. It's a revelation of the world Christ enters into. It's a revelation of the world that Christ enters into and assumes. Okay, a revelation of that kind enters into the brokenness of human beings with the divine love, with God's love, right? A revelation of the deep wounds Christ comes to heal. Okay? And in Stu's hands, Judges becomes a text that forms Christian hope, actually, not by offering heroic examples, but by showing us the limits of human heroism. Okay, and by showing us the grotesque, the book drives us to see the beauty of Jesus. And with that, this has been Apocalypse here. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and share if you are interested in more content like this, especially on Old Testament stuff, which I haven't done much about. Let me know, and I'd be happy to do that. And with that, this has been Apocalypse here. Christianity you can live with.